The dog wouldn't go in. Ranger, a seasoned German shepherd with scars beneath his fur and eyes sharp as glass, stopped just short of the cave's mouth. His hackles rose, his body tensed, and a low growl started in his throat, vibrating like the warning hum of a storm coming in. He didn't glance at Lucas. His gaze was locked into the black void of the cave, unblinking, ears up, breath quick. Lucas Brandt frowned. The bitter wind carried the sharp tang of pine and the faint rot of leaves decaying underfoot. He adjusted the strap of the pack over his shoulder and stepped forward. "What's the matter, boy?" he asked, trying to keep his tone steady. Ranger didn't budge. Instead, he backed up a step, still growling, tail stiff, then suddenly bolted forward, straight into the darkness, swallowed whole by the cave before Lucas could yell. "Ranger, come back!" Lucas shouted, his voice echoing off the granite walls. Silence. Not even a scuff of paw pads. Just the sound of wind and the distant creak of swaying aspens. The blackness inside the cave gaped open like a wound. Lucas stood still, chest tight, instinct warring with old memories. He hadn't meant to come back here. Not really. When the lawyer called 3 days ago to tell him his estranged brother Wyatt had died, heart failure, alone in a rented room above the butcher shop, it barely registered. They hadn't spoken in 30 years. The only thing Wyatt left behind in his will was this worthless patch of land and the cave that came with it. "Just the cave," the lawyer had said. "No house, no assets, no debts either. Just the cave on the hill. Deeds clear. Yours now," Lucas had laughed when he hung up. A dry, bitter thing that sounded like a cough. He hadn't climbed this ridge in decades. He wasn't here for nostalgia. He came with a hammer, nails, and 2 wooden planks to board up the cave for good. Close the door on ghosts, be done with it. And now Ranger was gone into the dark. Lucas clenched his jaw, scanned the entrance and hesitated. He hated caves, always had. A root cellar collapse when he was 7 left him buried for 4 hours in black silence before Wyatt had dug him out with bare hands and a toy shovel. After that, Lucas never stepped into anything that didn't have 2 exits and sunlight. He could still remember the way the air had thinned inside his lungs, the scream stuck in his throat, the cold pressing in like water, but he couldn't leave Ranger. "Damn it!" Lucas muttered under his breath, throwing his pack to the ground and kneeling beside it. His hands moved quickly. Flashlight, rope, knife, his old SIG sour tucked into the side compartment. The flashlight's beam lit up strong, revealing the rough rock walls just inside the cave, water-worn and slick in spots. He forced his breath to slow. "I swear to God, dog," he muttered. "You'd better be chasing a raccoon and not having some kind of sixth sense episode." He took 1 step in. Then 2. The temperature dropped instantly, like stepping into a cellar, and the air smelled of wet rock and old wood. The beam of light cut ahead in a narrow cone. The silence was suffocating. Then came the sound. A single bark. Muffled, distant, but distinct. "Ranger!" Lucas called, stepping forward quickly now. He followed the passage, ducking slightly where the ceiling dipped, moving around a sharp bend he didn't remember being there. Another bark, closer, urgent. He turned the corner and stopped cold. There, in the middle of a wide stone chamber, Ranger stood completely still, tail stiff, eyes locked on something in front of him. Lucas's flashlight swept across the floor and landed on a large, dust-covered wooden box. Old weather-stained, the kind used in mines a century ago. Lucas blinked. Ranger didn't move. "Is that what you wanted me to see?" He approached slowly. The box looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, yet something about its placement, centered, deliberate, felt recent. Fresh boot prints circled the edge. Lucas crouched beside it, brushing away decades of dirt. The lid wasn't nailed down, just closed. He reached out and lifted it open. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth and carefully stacked, were relics. Childhood things. A carved wooden horse, a slingshot, rocks with glittering veins. A photo, yellowed and soft around the edges, showing two boys in front of this very cave, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning wide. Lucas staggered back a step. That photo had been taken the summer he turned 11. Wyatt had made the horse for him that year. They'd used the slingshot to terrorize squirrels for 3 days before their father took it away. That obsidian rock, he remembered pretending it was a dragon tooth they'd found deep in the mountain. He stared at the items, heart thudding in his chest. Why were these here? The only people who could have known about them were him and Wyatt. Why would he? Lucas whispered. Behind him, Ranger let out a single, low whine. Lucas turned, startled, and followed the dog's gaze to a second crate, half buried in the rock wall. Smaller, metal, locked. Ranger moved to it, pawed at the side, then looked back at Lucas. It wasn't just a memory box. This was a trailhead, and Ranger had just found the first marker. Lucas stood slowly, the flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The cave he'd come to seal shut had just opened a door back into a past he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But something about the way Ranger sat beside that crate, alert but calm, told him this wasn't about the cave anymore. It was about what his brother had left behind, and what he'd been trying to say for 30 silent years. The air felt thinner the deeper Lucas went, not because of elevation or lack of oxygen, but because of memory. The flashlight cast sharp angles on the stone walls, revealing tool marks, water stains, and occasional glints of mica. Ranger trotted ahead at a steady pace, not rushing, not sniffing. Just moving with the quiet confidence of a creature that knew exactly where it was going. Lucas, on the other hand, felt every muscle in his body tense like coiled wire. Claustrophobia sat on his chest like a loaded pack. It had started in Kandahar 12 years ago, when an IED buried half his unit under rubble, and he'd spent 5 hours pinned under a collapsed concrete wall with the body of a fellow soldier across his legs. They'd pulled him out alive, but not unchanged. Ever since, tight spaces made his vision narrow, his breath hitch, and his fight-or-flight response kick into overdrive. And yet here he was, crawling deeper into a dark, narrow cave, following a dog who couldn't be bribed, commanded, or stopped. He almost turned back. Twice. But Ranger looked over his shoulder just once, halfway through a tight curve in the passage, and Lucas kept going. He didn't trust caves, but he trusted Ranger. The chamber opened up faster than Lucas expected. One moment he was ducking under a low stone shelf, the next he stepped into a space the size of a one-car garage. Cool, silent, and dry. Ranger stood in the center of it, not moving, facing a large crate pushed against the far wall. Lucas moved the light toward it. A wooden box, maybe 3 feet wide, sealed with rusted latches and worn from time. On the top, a layer of dust at least an inch thick, except where Ranger's paw had pressed into it. Lucas crossed the chamber, breath steadying slightly. He knelt beside the box and brushed the dust from one of the latches. It squeaked open, stubborn but not locked. The second latch came free with less resistance. He opened the lid. Inside, stillness. And then, a wave of something he hadn't felt in years. Not nostalgia, not grief. Something deeper, something like recognition. There, wrapped in oiled canvas and old flannel shirts, were objects from a childhood that felt like it had belonged to someone else. A carved wooden horse, small, crude, painted blue and white with chipped paint on one ear, a tin box full of quartz and fool's gold, a slingshot with its elastic rotted and sagging, a compass with a cracked glass face, and a photograph. Lucas picked it up with careful hands. The corners were curled, but the image was clear. 2 boys, one in a faded ball cap, the other missing his 2 front teeth, both grinning wide, arms around each other's shoulders, standing right in front of the very cave they were now inside. Him and Wyatt, summer of '67. Lucas remembered the day like fog, warm sun, buzzing flies, and the taste of peaches straight from the can. Their mum had taken the photo. Their dad had shouted something about, "Don't be late for supper." And Wyatt had slipped the wooden horse into Lucas's pack on the way back down the hill. Lucas hadn't seen that horse in decades. Ranger moved closer and sat beside him, quiet and still. After a moment, the dog leaned forward and nudged the horse with his nose, then looked up at Lucas, as if to say, "You see it now, don't you?" Lucas swallowed hard. "Yeah," he whispered. "I see it." It wasn't just a box of keepsakes, it was a message, a breadcrumb trail. Proof that Wyatt had come back here over and over again, not just to remember, but to hold on to something Lucas had let go of a long time ago. He ran a hand across the wooden carving. It had Wyatt's signature under the base, burned in with a soldering iron. WB 1967. And something else, a short phrase, barely visible, scratched in by hand. For my brother. Lucas blinked fast, looking away. "I threw it out," he said aloud, as if confessing to the stone walls. "I tossed it in a box when I left for basic." Never even thought about it again. Ranger didn't move, just kept his gaze fixed, soft but unmoving. Lucas turned his head upward, staring at the ceiling of the cave. So many years spent angry, so many birthdays skipped, so many letters never sent, and this stupid little box had been waiting the whole time. Why? Why preserve this? He looked at the dog again. Ranger hadn't found this by accident. He hadn't sniffed out food or prey. He had gone straight to this chamber, straight to this box, like he'd been here before. "Did he bring you here?" Lucas asked quietly. Ranger blinked once. It was possible. The timing worked. Lucas had adopted Ranger 3 years ago from a K9 handler retiring in Missoula. But before that, Ranger had been stationed with local law enforcement. His records showed he'd been deployed for search and recovery missions across western Montana, including Cedar County, including this mountain. Had Wyatt encountered him? Maybe fed him. Maybe let him tag along during one of his trips to the cave. Maybe this dog had been the only companion Wyatt had left in his final years. Lucas stood, walked to the far wall, and stared into the deeper passage that branched off into darkness. Cold air drifted up from it like breath. There was more to this cave, more to this story. He turned back to the box. Carefully, methodically, he rewrapped the contents, returned the horse, the rocks, the slingshot. He placed the photograph last, smoothing the edges before closing the lid. Then he looked at Ranger. "You're trying to show me something, aren't you?" Ranger wagged his tail once, a small, precise motion, then turned and walked toward the far tunnel. Lucas's flashlight beam followed. He hesitated for just a second, then followed the dog into the dark. Lucas didn't remember the cave being this deep when he was a kid. Back then it had felt like a quick thrill, a dark hole with just enough danger to make them feel like adventurers. But now, as the flashlight beam caught jagged corners and damp streaks down the limestone walls, it felt entirely different. This wasn't a playground. It was something closer to a vault. Ranger's steps were silent on the packed earth floor, but his posture had changed. No longer casual or calm, his ears were forward, body low, nose flicking left and right, as if each particle of air held a secret. He wasn't just tracking scent. He was reading something Lucas couldn't begin to understand. The tunnel narrowed again, then opened into a second chamber. Smaller than the first, but clearly used. The floor had been leveled with planks, A dented metal folding chair sat near the back wall beside a camping lantern long out of fuel. Next to it, a crate. Military surplus, the kind Lucas recognized instantly. Olive drab, with faded stenciling and worn handles. Ranger padded over and sat beside it, looking back at Lucas expectantly. Lucas approached and popped the latches. Inside were papers. Dozens of them. Some in manila folders, some loose, some bound in rubber bands. All dry, all organized, and all obviously placed with care. He reached for the top stack. A dog-eared journal, the spine nearly torn, the cover scribbled with Wyatt's messy handwriting. Lucas flipped it open and scanned the first page. June 9th. Thought about writing him again today. Didn't. Maybe someday. The cave's quieter than I remember, but I think Ranger still likes it here. Lucas paused. Ranger, he muttered. You knew him. The dog's tail thumped once. Confirmation. Lucas kept reading. I left the carving. Maybe he'll find it. Maybe he won't. Still don't know how to fix what I broke, but I can't seem to stop coming back here. It's the only place that doesn't judge me. The pages continued. Date after date. Year after year. Wyatt had used this cave like a confessional. Dozens of notebooks recorded everything from grocery lists to memories of their father to rants about politics. But through all of it, a single thread wove steady and constant. Regret. Lucas sat down slowly, knees stiff, back against the cold wall. The cave felt tighter again. He pulled out more folders. Letters, some sealed, some not. Most addressed to him. Lucas Winter's General Delivery Flagstaff, Arizona. Others bore addresses he hadn't lived at in decades. Wyatt had been writing him this whole time, but never sent a single one. He reached for a yellow envelope, sealed with electrical tape. Inside was a folded map. It was hand-drawn, rough but detailed. It outlined the cave system, more extensive than Lucas had guessed, with marks on key turns and notations in Wyatt's handwriting. One corner was circled in red. Near the edge of the map, a line of writing stood alone, pressed into the page in bold graphite. For Lucas, if he ever forgives me. Lucas stared at the words, heart pounding hard. Why hide this? He asked aloud. Ranger shifted, then moved to the far edge of the chamber. He stood still beside a stack of wooden crates, clearly newer than the rest of the gear. Lucas stood, walked over, and pulled the top crate aside. Beneath it, buried under loose rock and dirt, was something metal. He knelt, brushed away debris, and uncovered the edge of a metal trap door, the kind used in old mine shafts. No lock, just a recessed handle. Ranger whined low. Not a warning, more like urgency. Lucas hesitated, gripped the handle and pulled. The hatch creaked open to reveal a dark shaft with a rickety wooden ladder descending into more shadow. He turned to Ranger. You sure about this? Ranger didn't flinch, just looked down the hole, then back at Lucas. Lucas took a breath and descended. The ladder groaned under his weight. Each rung dipped slightly, but held. 10 feet down, then 15. The air grew cooler, dustier. The scent changed, no longer just earth and mildew, but something sharper. Oil, metal, ink? He reached bottom and stepped onto a floor of packed gravel. His flashlight swept the space. A small room carved into the rock, this one clearly man-made. There were shelves, boxes, cabinets with labels in Wyatt's handwriting, deeds, safe keys. Old mines, prospects. In the center, a table with a single, sealed manila envelope sitting neatly on top. A strip of blue tape held it closed. Lucas picked it up, heart in his throat. His name was written across the front. He didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, he looked around the room, the ledgers, the old maps, even a safe bolted to the wall. Wyatt had been hiding something. Something real. Something deliberate. something that went far beyond old guilt. This wasn't a cave. It was a vault, a legacy, and maybe a confession. Ranger padded up beside him and sat. Lucas finally opened the envelope. Inside was a short letter. Wyatt's handwriting again. Tight, precise. Lucas, if you're reading this, I didn't get the chance to make things right, face to face. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I hope you'll try to understand. There's more here than old junk, and it's not just about money. Though, yeah, there's money too. But I wanted you to know, I never stopped being your brother, even when I didn't deserve to be. What's buried here isn't just secrets. It's my way of trying to put things back. You'll know what to do. You always did. W. Lucas stood there in silence. Then slowly he looked at the safe. Ranger stood with him, and together they faced what Wyatt had left behind. The silence in the vault was louder than any battlefield Lucas had ever known. He stood with the letter still in his hand, the words blurring at the edges. He read them again, and again. Each time, the same burning question clawed its way back. Why now? Why wait until it was too late? Why bury this apology instead of saying it out loud, when it could have meant something? His fingers clenched around the paper. "You coward," he whispered, voice cracking. He slammed the envelope back on the table and turned away, jaw tight, breath shallow. His boots scuffed against the gravel floor as he paced the small space, barely able to keep still. The anger came like a wave. "I waited!" he growled. "Damn it, Wyatt, I waited for years!" A call, a visit, a note under the damn door. Anything? He grabbed the edge of the metal table and flipped it over with a guttural yell. The legs scraped and squealed against the rock, clattering into the wall. Ranger barked, once, sharp and firm. Lucas spun to face him. "Don't!" he snapped. "Don't you start!" But Ranger didn't back down. He stood between Lucas and the upturned table, eyes locked on him, tail stiff. Another bark, not angry, not scared, almost corrective. Lucas took a step forward, chest heaving. "I'm supposed to what? Forgive him because he wrote a damn letter and hid it in a cave like some twisted treasure hunt?" Ranger barked again. Lucas's face twisted. "He left me. He left me alone with that nightmare of a father. He ran, Ranger didn't move." Lucas's voice broke. "I didn't get a choice." He did. He drove a fist into the cave wall. Rock tore skin from his knuckles. He barely noticed. The pain was dull compared to what was already erupting inside him. You don't get to come back with a note and think it erases everything. His breath rattled through his chest. The cave, once a space of strange, buried warmth, now felt suffocating. Ranger stepped closer. Quiet now. He nudged Lucas's leg. Not demanding, just there. Lucas looked down, his jaw trembling. The tears caught him off guard. One drop hit the dirt floor, and then another. He dropped to one knee, pressing his bloody hand against the cool stone, forehead bowing until it touched the earth. "I hated him," he whispered. Ranger leaned into him. "I loved him." Lucas choked. They stayed like that for a long moment, man and dog in the silence of the past. Then Lucas stood, not slowly, abruptly. Without a word, he turned toward the tunnel, moving fast. The flashlight beam bounced with each angry step. Ranger followed, but Lucas raised a hand. "Stay." Ranger froze. Lucas didn't look back. He climbed the ladder, his breath jagged, jaw clenched so tight it ached. The hatch creaked shut behind him, the metallic echo ringing like a slammed door between decades. Outside, the desert was blazing with late afternoon light, a heat that pressed against his skin like punishment. He squinted, trying to breathe normally. The pickup truck waited where he'd left it, dust-coated and silent. Lucas got in and slammed the door. The engine roared to life, tires crunching as he backed up, then turned violently onto the dirt road. The mirror caught a glimpse of the cave's jagged mouth. Ranger's silhouette appeared in the entrance. Lucas hit the gas. He didn't see the way Ranger didn't chase, didn't hear the soft, mournful whine behind him. He just drove. Each mile was meant to bury it all again, deeper than the letters, deeper than the shame, deeper than the kind of pain you only feel when the apology comes after the grave. But some things refused to stay, buried. And the silence in that truck wasn't empty. It was full of the things he never got to say. Lucas didn't sleep. He lay in the truck with the engine off, headlights dimmed, the cab filling with desert silence. Dust clung to the windshield like ash. The only movement was the slow rise and fall of his chest. Ranger had not moved from the cave entrance. Even now, hours later, Lucas could see the silhouette through the rearview mirror, still and waiting. Like he understood this was not about disobedience. It was about space, about the kind of storm a dog couldn't stop, only sit beside once it passed. Eventually Lucas got out. The wind had cooled, brushing across his neck as he crossed the gravel back to the cave. He didn't call Ranger, didn't have to. As he descended the ladder again, Ranger was already halfway down, paws silent on the rungs like he'd done it 1,000 times. Lucas didn't speak. Didn't need to. He returned to the back room where he'd flipped the table earlier, now upright again thanks to Ranger's quiet persistence. The papers were still scattered, the letters fanned like lost feathers across the floor. Most were dated, methodical, but one envelope was different, older, creased, the ink smudged where sweat or tears had once touched it. The handwriting wobbled. "To Lucas if I don't make it." Lucas stared at the words. His hand hovered over it. Then, slowly, he sat cross-legged on the ground, Ranger settling beside him. He opened the envelope. Inside was a single page, yellowed, soft at the edges, written in ink that had bled from time and trembling hands. "Lucas, if you're reading this, I didn't come back, and I guess I don't deserve to. I ran. God, I ran like hell. I left you behind with that monster, and I've hated myself for it every day, but I was a coward. I told myself I'd make it right someday. Then the years passed. Then shame turned into silence. But I never forgot you. Never stopped checking in from a distance. I want to tell you something. Not to earn forgiveness. I know I forfeited that. But maybe to leave you with something real. 30 years ago I found something up here. Something Dad never told us about. A vein of silver, deep in the rocks beyond the North Ridge. I filed it quietly. Under your name. You were always the one who stuck it out, who endured, who deserved better. I didn't tell you because it would have felt like I was buying my way back in. But I protected it. For you. It's still there. I wish I could say this face to face. I wish I could hug you and let you punch me, cry, whatever you needed. But if this is the only way, then at least you'll know. I loved you, big brother. I was just too broken to show it." Wyatt Lucas couldn't breathe. He read the letter once, then again, the words beginning to blur as something inside him cracked. Not in anger this time, not in bitterness, but in grief. Deep, guttural, aching grief. The kind you hold back, for decades until a sentence breaks the dam. He folded the letter to his chest, head bowed. His body began to shake. A sob escaped before he could stop it. Then another. And then they came like a flood. Years of silence crashing into a single breath. Ranger pressed into his side, not nudging now, just there, steady, present, like a heartbeat that wouldn't leave him. Lucas gasped through tears. He didn't want to buy forgiveness. He just wanted me to know. The silver didn't matter now. Not really. The map, the hidden claim, the fact that his life could have looked different years ago, It all faded beneath one truth. Wyatt never stopped loving him. Lucas had spent half his life angry, convinced he'd been discarded. But here, buried in a letter left in the belly of a cave, was the kind of confession that didn't ask for absolution. Only understanding. And that's what broke him. Not guilt, not greed, but the unbearable weight of a brother's love, carried in silence for 30 years. When the tears slowed, Lucas looked at Ranger. The dog's eyes held no judgment, just patience, just presence. He placed the letter carefully back in the envelope. Stood up, steadier now. His chest still hurt, but the ache had changed. Softer, maybe. Sadder. He whispered, "Let's go find that mine." Ranger's ears perked. Lucas glanced back at the dim tunnel behind them. "For both of us this time," he said. Then he clicked on the flashlight, and the two of them stepped into the dark again. Not to bury the past, but to unearth what was left of it. Lucas never used to believe dogs could remember maps, but now, watching Ranger move, he wasn't so sure. The cave's air was cooler the deeper they went, but the air wasn't what made Lucas shiver. It was the way Ranger kept stopping just before a turn, glancing back like, "You coming?" Then continuing down with eerie precision. The flashlight trembled in Lucas's hand, partly from nerves, partly from awe. Ranger didn't just know the way, he remembered it. Every corner, every narrow path, like he'd walked it over and over again, just not with Lucas. With Wyatt. Lucas paused at the thought. He looked down at Ranger, who had stopped again, tail wagging once before sitting beside a rusted steel door embedded into stone. A padlock hung on the latch, old, corroded, but snapped clean in half. Someone had already come through, and left it open. Lucas pushed the door. It creaked open with a groan. Inside was nothing like the rest of the cave. This wasn't natural rock anymore. It had been carved, expanded. A low ceiling arched above, braced with beams. Crates stacked neatly along the walls, a workbench in the far corner, a map pinned to a corkboard yellowed with age. Lucas stepped in. Dust curled in the air, dancing in the flashlight's beam. He opened the first crate. Documents, manila folders, ledgers. He flipped one open. Inside was a survey map, marked with coordinates, a silver vein, line drawn in red ink. Beneath it, stamped in faded blue, proven yield, unclaimed. Lucas swallowed hard. He moved to the workbench, where a coffee can sat with a stack of envelopes beside it. All of them addressed to him. He sat down, pulled one free. Inside was a photocopy of a mining rights deed. The land title had been transferred 20 years ago. To Lucas's name. Without his knowledge. He stared at it, dumbfounded. Then turned to the next envelope. Inside was a rejection letter from a mining company. "Thank you for your offer, Mr. Wyatt Green, but we regretfully decline." He opened another. This one from a different company. "Mr. Green, your decision to hold the land rather than sell remains respected." Then another, and another. Ranger whined, drawing Lucas's eyes to a stack of smaller notes, handwritten on old receipts from towns Lucas hadn't been to in decades. Lucas was at the hardware store today, looked tired, left without buying the wrench. Sent one anonymously, neighbor complained about his barn again. Paid off the inspector. Hope he never finds out each one was a snapshot. A moment. A breadcrumb of quiet love. Lucas felt a wave of heat rise in his chest. He'd been angry for so long, angry at being abandoned, forgotten, forced to rebuild his life with nothing but scars and calluses. But Wyatt hadn't disappeared. He'd been behind the curtain the whole time, watching, shielding, protecting him the only way he knew how. Silently. Lucas ran a hand down his face. Ranger nudged his elbow. "You knew," Lucas whispered. You were down here with him." Ranger wagged his tail but didn't move, as if confirming it, as if he'd been the bridge all along. Lucas turned back to the table, laying out the contents. Copies of bank drafts, registered claims, estimates from geologists. He wasn't an expert, but even he could tell what this all meant. This wasn't just an old mine, it was a gold mine made of silver. And his name was on all of it. Lucas leaned back, breathless. He laughed once, dry and quiet. $10 million? Maybe more. He looked down at Ranger. "You know how many fences I could finally afford to fix?" Ranger barked. Once, not loud, but sharp, affirming. Lucas gathered the papers into a backpack, took the map from the wall. He turned back one last time and spotted an old Polaroid taped under the edge of the bench. It was grainy, faded. Wyatt, younger, standing in this very room, smiling. And beside him, smaller, leaner, but unmistakable, was Ranger. Lucas touched the photo gently, then took it down and slid it into his coat pocket. When he looked at Ranger again, the dog's eyes locked with his. He didn't need words. They were in this together now. As they stepped out of the chamber, Lucas felt lighter. Not because of the money, but because he finally understood. What Wyatt had done wasn't about riches. It was legacy. A legacy built not in dollars, but in loyalty, in guilt, in the long, hard silence of someone trying to make it right. And in the end, it was a dog, quiet, loyal, patient, who'd carried that legacy through the dark, waiting for the day Lucas would be ready to see it. And now he was. The last crawl space was tighter than the rest. Lucas had to duck low, his back brushing against jagged rock, boots grinding through grit and time. Ranger stayed close behind, his breathing calm and steady, ears alert to the silence that now pressed in all around them. At the end of the narrow passage, the walls opened into a chamber barely large enough for a man to kneel. The flashlight beam swept across the stone and shadow, and there, nestled against the far wall, was a cedar crate, worn and greyed with age. Lucas crouched, pried it open. 2 wooden crosses lay inside. They were hand-carved, small, just under a foot tall. Simple, no ornamentation, but the care in their making was unmistakable. Sanded edges, rounded corners. On each a name had been burned into the grain with a hot nail or wire. The first said, Wyatt Green. The second said, Lucas Green. Lucas froze. He stared at the names, his breath locked in his chest, the quiet pressing hard now. These weren't grave markers someone made on a whim. They were prepared, deliberate, thoughtful. His brother had made one for himself, and one for him. He looked back at Ranger, who had lowered himself beside him, chin resting on Lucas's boot like a child seeking warmth. "You knew, didn't you?" Lucas whispered. Ranger's eyes didn't move. There was no wag this time, just stillness, presence. Lucas turned back to the crosses, fingertips brushing the smooth cedar. It wasn't the kind of wood that would last long outdoors, not unless you intended to replace them every year. But maybe that was the point. He picked up the one with his name. At the bottom, carved faintly, nearly invisible, were the initials WG. Wyatt didn't just want them to rest in the same place. He wanted them to be remembered together. As brothers, not enemies. As 2 boys who once shared a bunk bed, a paper route, and a dog they weren't supposed to keep. Lucas sat back, hands trembling slightly. He remembered the last time he and Wyatt had spoken. Really spoken, not barked or blamed or bit. It had been on their mother's porch, the morning after the funeral. Wyatt had said something about not being ready to lose more. Lucas had scoffed, turned away, slammed his truck door, and never looked back. But Wyatt had never stopped looking back. Not really. He'd just stopped saying it out loud. Lucas looked around the chamber again. There was a second crate, this one still sealed. He pried it open with a pocket knife and found old camping gear, 2 folded sleeping bags, and a notebook on top. The first page held a single sentence. "In case he ever comes looking." Lucas swallowed hard. Wyatt had made a place for them here, not just in death, but in life, in healing, in memory. Lucas stood, crosses in hand, and looked at Ranger. The dog didn't move, but his gaze followed Lucas like a shadow, as if knowing this moment mattered more than any command or gesture. Lucas whispered, "You brought me here for this, didn't you?" A soft exhale from Ranger, almost a sigh. Almost yes. He knelt again, set the crosses side by side in the soft dirt floor, not to bury but to mark. A promise, not an ending. He'd find the right place to put them later, under sky, near the sycamore tree by the ridge, where he and Wyatt used to camp out as kids and pretend they were the only 2 souls who mattered in the world. Lucas rested a hand on Ranger's back. "Thank you," he said, voice low, raw. Ranger leaned into him, not with weight, but with quiet permission, as if saying, "Now you know, now you remember." And Lucas did. He remembered the laughter, the pranks, the scraped knees, the whispered dreams under stars. He remembered who they were before pride and anger had grown taller than the fences between them. Now those fences had been torn down, and in their place stood 2 simple crosses, not graves, but anchors. Lucas leaned against the wall, letting the quiet settle. Ranger curled beside him, head on Lucas's thigh, eyes half-lidded in that content, vigilant way only dogs understand. Outside, the world still turned, but in this deep place of silence, beneath layers of rock and regret, something had shifted. 2 names, 1 bond, and a dog who refused to let either be forgotten. The cemetery hadn't changed. Same rusted gate that creaked on its hinges. Same cracked stone path that wound up through dry grass and cottonwood roots. But the weight Lucas carried this time was different. He parked the truck just beyond the old fence and stepped out with the small metal tin in his hand. It was dented along one edge and smelled faintly of oil and rust. He'd found it tucked deep in the root cellar behind a loose board. Inside was Tommy's urn. Not the kind you'd get from a funeral home, just a coffee can with tape around the lid and "Tommy" scrawled in faded Sharpie. Lucas hadn't opened it. Didn't need to. The weight of it in his hands was enough. Ranger walked beside him, quiet, step for step. The dog hadn't strayed more than a few feet from his side since they left the cave, as if some unspoken promise had passed between them. The morning sun cut through the bare tree limbs in long stripes. The wind carried a dry chill, not biting, just honest, like everything else about this place. Lucas reached the spot slowly. A pair of headstones stood there, worn smooth by years of weather, side by side under the shade of a leaning sycamore. Eleanor Green, Walter Green, his parents. He remembered planting that tree as a kid with Tommy. They'd fought over who would get to dig first. In the end, their mum made them share the shovel. Now it was tall enough to bend in the wind like it was listening. Lucas knelt and set the tin down. He didn't rush. Pulled a small trowel from his coat pocket and dug a clean, shallow patch in the earth beside the headstones. He looked at the tin one last time, then opened it. The ash inside was soft grey, like talcum. Lucas poured slowly, careful not to let the breeze carry it. Every grain felt like a breath returned to soil. He buried the remains gently, then reached into his bag and pulled out one of the 2 carved crosses, the one with Tommy's name. He pressed it into the ground. Then he sat, not on the bench, not on a folding chair, just in the dirt, knees bent, Ranger at his side. The dog rested his head on Lucas's thigh, eyes closed but alert, like always. Lucas stared at the cross. He hadn't brought flowers, hadn't rehearsed a speech, just 5 words. "Forgive me too, Tommy," he said. The words came out dry, almost broken, but they stayed. They didn't scatter in the wind. He rubbed Ranger's head, the fur behind his ears warm from the sun. "I should have called," he murmured. "Should have answered when you did. Should have tried harder to be—" The words trailed off. No point finishing the sentence. Tommy already knew. Lucas closed his eyes. There was no choir, no crowd, no ceremony, just the creak of sycamore branches above and the steady heartbeat of a dog who had seen it all and stayed anyway. The stillness wasn't empty. It was full of years, of memories, of what-ifs that no longer cut quite as deep. Lucas stayed until the sun passed its peak. He didn't cry. Not this time. What needed breaking had already broken back in the mine, in that chamber where names were carved and a bond mended in silence. When he finally stood, he looked down one last time. The cross leaned slightly in the soft dirt, and that felt right. He turned to leave, but not before placing his palm flat over the ground. "You're home," he said softly. "Next to them." Like you always wanted, Ranger stood, gave a small chuff, barely a bark, more breath than sound, and followed as Lucas walked back to the truck. The gate closed behind them with a tired groan. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. The small town of Hayfield had never held a press conference before. The community centre had hosted potlucks, quilt shows, and a few awkward junior dances. But nothing quite like this. Still, the folding chairs were packed. Local ranchers in dusty boots sat beside city officials in button-down shirts. Kids fidgeted in their seats while parents shushed them. Everyone craned their necks toward the modest podium set up near the makeshift stage, where a banner stretched overhead. Brant Family Preserve Dedication Ceremony. Lucas stood behind the podium, his hands steady on the wood. He wore a clean flannel, but his jeans and boots were scuffed. He hadn't dressed up. He hadn't needed to. Next to him sat Ranger, alert but calm, a red bandana tied neatly around his neck. The only sound in the room for a long moment was the soft whir of fans overhead and the occasional creak of a chair. Lucas cleared his throat. "My brother Tommy loved these mountains," he began. "He loved this land even when most of us had stopped believing in it." He paused. No notes, just memory. "Years ago he tried to tell me there was something worth saving here. I didn't listen. Now I know better." He reached down and rested a hand on Ranger's back. The dog stayed still, but his ears perked up as if he understood the weight of the moment. In the last few weeks, this dog, this friend, led me back through every mistake I'd buried, and he never once asked for anything in return. Lucas stepped aside as Mayor Carol Jennings came forward. She was short, grey-haired, with a voice that carried like it had decades of PTA meetings behind it. "Today we officially renamed the old mining cave and surrounding forest as the Brant Family Preserve," she announced. "It will be protected from development." Forever applause rose, sharp and grateful. "And," she continued, glancing toward Ranger with a smile, "we have one more honor to bestow." A young girl in a scout uniform stepped up, carrying a small box with a velvet lining. Inside was a silver medallion etched with an evergreen tree, a pickaxe, and a paw print. "For bravery, loyalty, and service to this town and to the Brant family," the mayor said, "we award Ranger the Hayfield Medal of Civic Honor." She crouched to gently place the ribbon over the dog's neck. Ranger tilted his head, blinked once, then leaned into Lucas's leg like it was just another Tuesday. The applause returned, stronger this time. Someone in the back stood, then others followed. Lucas didn't smile for the crowd. He just looked down at Ranger and whispered, Not bad for a dog who never barked for glory. Later that afternoon, as the ceremony gave way to shared casseroles and outdoor photos, Lucas walked to the edge of the preserve trailhead. A new wooden sign stood tall among the pines. Brandt Family Preserve. In memory of Thomas Brandt, 1987 to 2016. Some roots go deeper than time. He touched the carved wood, ran his fingers over the letters like a prayer. The preserve wouldn't just be a patch of protected forest. It would house an educational center, a food co-op for mountain families, and a small grant fund to support sustainable farming in the region. The Tommy Brandt Legacy Fund was already seeded with part of the settlement Lucas had received from a mining corporation that had once tried to buy the land through shady means. The documents Tommy left behind had made their bluff collapse like rotten timbers. Lucas had offered every cent of it to the community. No one in Hayfield had expected that. But then again, no one expected the Brandt brothers' legacy to return from the shadows. And maybe that was the point. At sunset, Lucas sat on a flat rock by the trailhead. Ranger lay beside him, head resting on his paws, nose twitching, as if following an invisible scent on the breeze. "You know," Lucas said quietly, "you didn't have to stay. You could have turned back." Ranger lifted his head. "But you didn't." The wind picked up, rustling the treetops with a low whisper. Somewhere far off, an owl hooted once, twice. Lucas looked down at Ranger, then back to the mountains that had once felt like a cage. Now they felt like home. The first winter snow fell light and silent, dusting the pine branches above the old mining trail. Visitors moved carefully along the path, following the markers toward the Brandt Family Preserve Welcome Center. It wasn't grand, just a repurposed ranger station and a few wooden cabins, but it felt alive. Kids laughed, elders nodded in quiet memory, and tucked inside the visitors' center, beneath soft yellow lights and the smell of cedar, hung two photographs side by side. The first was faded with age but full of life. Two boys, maybe 9 and 11, grinning wide as they stood in front of the cave's entrance. One of them, Tommy, wore a ball cap too big for his head and held a stick like a sword. The other, Lucas, had his arm slung over his brother's shoulder. Behind them, the cave loomed like a secret waiting to be told. The second photo had been taken just 6 months ago. Lucas, now weathered and lined by the years, stood with Ranger at his side. One hand rested gently on the wooden cross planted by the small memorial plot near the cave mouth. The same eyes looked out from the frame, but they held more peace now, more weight, and more understanding. Beneath the pictures, a brass plaque read, "They found something here worth saving." Not gold, not history. Family Lucas never planned to write it all down. But when the letters from the townspeople started piling up, thank yous from parents whose children had learned the story during school tours, letters from veterans who had served with dogs like Ranger, notes from strangers who saw the preserve on the news, he realized the truth needed space to breathe. So he wrote. He didn't call it a memoir. He didn't even sign his name on the cover. The title was simple: What He Left Behind. The pages told Tommy's story, how he believed in the mountains even when no one else did, how he left behind not just a journal and a cave of forgotten things, but a path home. It told Ranger's story too, not in chapters of barking or battles, but in the quiet work of a creature who knew grief when it walked through the door and knew exactly when to sit beside it without a sound. The final paragraph of the book read, "I didn't come back for the gold. I came back because a boy once smiled at me through the dust and believed we could fix something broken, and because a dog waited long enough for me to remember who I was." Ranger passed away 3 springs later, old and beloved. The town held a small service, unprompted. The children painted stones with his name. An artist carved his likeness into the trail sign. and every tour since includes a stop by the place where he used to sit, head high, eyes steady, like a sentry made of heart. Lucas grew older. He no longer climbed the trails with the same speed, but he still made the walk to the overlook most mornings. Sometimes he would stop by the photos, rest a hand on the frame, and whisper something only he and the wind understood. One quiet afternoon, a young woman on a school tour looked up at her guide and asked, "Did he ever find what he was looking for?" The guide smiled. "No," she said. "He found what he didn't know he'd lost." And now, as people visit the Brandt family preserve, as they walk the trails or read the weathered journal copies left on benches along the path, they're asked one last question, just beneath those two photographs, etched into the wood with care. What's your story with a loyal pet? Because maybe, like Lucas, someone out there is still carrying a truth that needs remembering, a name that needs saying, a silence that needs sitting with. Maybe it starts with a bark, or the lack of one. Maybe it starts now. If this story moved you, even a little, consider sharing your own story of loyalty and love. And if you believe in honoring the silent heroes with paws, please support our channel, German Shepherd, where we tell real stories that remind us of the ones who never needed words to be heard.